Academica Media. From Academica Media Studios in Miami, Florida, it's Big Ideas in Education, a weekly recap of inspiration and innovation in your schools.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Big Ideas in Education. I am Sarah Boulos 5 from Somerset Academy Schools, joined as always by my co-host Ryan Kairalla from Doral College. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Sarah. Good to see you.
Great to see you too. I'm excited to talk about some interesting topics today, and I know that you are really excited to talk about something that is going to really appeal to my nostalgia. What is that?
I'll say so. Look, I love every story I bring onto this show, but this one I could not be more excited to bring to you. This, as you said, gives me the nostalgia feels. This is from the 74. 2021, Sarah, marks the 50th anniversary of the first version of the Oregon Trail educational video game. Yes.
That takes me back.
Right? It takes solace back because most of us listening, regardless of our age, played some version of this game, whether it was on an old school Macintosh or a modern PC, or even today on a smartphone or tablet. But people might not know that the very first version of Oregon Trail was developed for a teletype machine all the way back in 1971. And that very first version, Sarah, was created by teachers. Student teachers, yeah, right?
Well, now that you say it, 50 years is a long time.
Yeah. I had no idea it preceded personal computing.
Yeah, I kind of thought of it as only a video game. So 50 years ago, I mean, I'm not like a video game historian, but it doesn't sound like there were a lot of video games back then.
Certainly not. So here's how it all came to be. This was student teachers Don Rawish, Bill Heineman, and Paul Dillenberger programmed the game in 10 days in a broom closet for Rawish's students at the Jordan Junior High School in Minnesota. The game, as you can imagine, was an instant hit at the school, with kids lining down the hall each morning for a chance to sit at the teletype machine with their friends and be transported to 1848 and hitch their wagon to the Willamette Valley. 3 years later, Rawish took a job at the nonprofit Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, or MEC, which helped develop a version of the game for the latest technical innovation, the desktop computer, which is the closer to the version that we probably played when we were kids, Sarah. That game became MEC's most popular title, and eventually MEC spun off into a for-profit company that sold new versions of the game over the decades. And today, the Oregon Trail is the most popular educational video game title. Since they gave the game to MEC back in 1974 with no expectation of compensation, the three teachers that created the game have never made any money off it.
But that is just so sad.
Well, they are proud of the game's legacy and the impact that it made on education, and teachers today praise the game for bringing American history to life and allowing generations of students to put themselves in the shoes of people in the past. And for me, Sarah, the fondness that I have for the game as an educator is, for me and for people of a certain age, it was kind of our first introduction to personal computing in schools. The first time I ever touched a personal computer in school, it was playing Oregon Trail on an Apple IIe computer. You had to stick the disc in the machine to play Oregon Trail. And I remember the first time it came out for a Macintosh, that was like out of Star Trek. We thought that was the coolest thing in the world. But it sort of started my love affair with computing and education that exists to this day.
I don't have as specific a memory as you do of it being the first, I don't remember the type of computer. I remember it being cool that we could play video games at school. I remember that. So I remember, I was a person who played Nintendo at home and Sega, I think we're both aging ourselves in this conversation, but
I think I lost most of the young people when I said Apple IIe. They're all laughing at us, but
not gonna lie, I'm not sure what that means. And at this point, I'm too afraid to ask. But I remember playing video games and feeling like it is the coolest thing ever that I'm allowed to play video games at school right now. Of course, kids now are like, that's hilarious. I can do whatever I want. But I remember thinking, and for some reason, we had tricked our teachers into believing this was educational. And we're like, ford the river, or whatever it was.
Hunt.
You get dysentery or whatever. And some vague memories, but they were always very positive.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'd be the first one to say that I'm not, at least those early versions of the game probably weren't paragons of historical accuracy. The early settlers that went west like didn't hunt nearly as much as people did playing that game, where you'd basically hunt like every chance you get because it was fun to like walk around and like shoot the animals. But I think it did spawn an interest in that time period, which then teachers could use as a springboard to teach, that thing in other lessons. And as you noted, it was a great way to expose students into the whole prospect of gamified learning and, building, the idea that like education and gaming didn't have to be, two mutually exclusive things. You could combine them together. And certainly the Oregon Trail was just the first of many different educational titles that have come out since. I remember playing an Amazon Trail game later on in my life, or games about business ownership or management, and just so many different titles. But the real original educational video game that spawned this whole genre was the Oregon Trail.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack and put on my teacher hat in a different way. Because I'm just thinking of myself as a student. I don't know that playing Oregon Trail really ever gave me any interest in learning about that time period or any of the, historical significance of it. I'll be honest, I don't know if it did. But something it did do, and this is something that as a teacher, I really tried to impart whenever I was working with my students, is it gave me a context. Gave me a context for if I heard something about Oregon Trail, or if I saw a covered wagon, or, if I saw something that kind of triggered a memory, it would activate what we in the educational space would call my schema, right? I had a foundation for building on that learning now. So if I saw something like maybe my teacher was talking about the Dust Bowl, I don't know what that is, but if I see a wagon or something like that, now I'm like, wait a minute, is it kind of like the Oregon Trail? Is it this? Is it that? It spurs some interest in the sense that I have a foundation upon which to build that knowledge. And so coming from a very educational, philosophical place and research, talking about how we learn on a very fundamental level, all learning builds upon other learning, right? All learning builds upon activating prior knowledge and activating that schema. So if you're coming to a student with no foundation upon which to build the Dust Bowl or whatever it is, I'm sure I have history teachers listening like, no, Sarah, the Dust Bowl was not related to Oregon Trail. I'm very sorry. But I'm just using that as a very bad example. At least there is something to kind of pull from and attach that learning to. So I think that exposing students to things like the Oregon Trail in a gamified way brings context. And so that I find to be really exciting. And we do that in classrooms, sometimes with games, sometimes with like short video clips, sometimes just with images, right? So if you see these images, this is what we're talking about, so that you can build that schema and that context for students.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the game did for me. Yeah.
That's awesome. No, I was the opposite. Like, this game got me obsessed with that whole time period. I would play this game, and then that sprung me into reading old trail diaries of people who were actually on the trail. I would watch the documentaries. Like, I got obsessed with it, and I would have never even thought to be if it weren't for this game. Like, I became a lot more of an expert on what actually happened there, which again, the game didn't necessarily reflect, especially back then, but it was a reference point, and it was a great one. And as much as I consider myself somebody to be obsessed with this game and have played so many versions of it, from the Apple IIe version all the way to like having it on my smartphone and playing it on Apple Arcade, I find it so upsetting that I didn't know where this came from and that it was created by teachers, which I think is just so delightful.
And I would love to know. I mean, there is no way I think those teachers could have imagined where their game would end up. But I wonder, what were their goals when they were developing it, right? Were they hoping that they would get their kids really excited and reading trail diaries? Were they just trying to build a foundation? Or were they just interested in making a game and they thought this would be a fun narrative for it? I just think there's so many questions I would love to ask them about what their ideas were behind the game. And then maybe your article talks a little bit about that. I'm not sure. But yeah, it brings up so many questions to my mind. As teachers, what were you thinking going into this?
It definitely covers some of that backstory to some extent, because the three gentlemen, I believe all three of them are still alive, and they did all do interviews for this really deep dive, comprehensive article that was done by the folks at the 74. Really, really cool. I encourage people to check it out, if for no other reason that it'll give you the nostalgia feels. Because I think the game's been around long enough that most of the people listening to this game were exposed to some version of it at some point in their educational lives, either as a student or a teacher. And I think it's nice to have that connection point for everybody. So, Sarah, what story do you have for us this week?
Well, when we first had schools closing as a result of COVID-19, I think a lot of us were asking same questions, right? How long is school going to be closed? Do we need to pick up homework for our children? What are we doing about lunch and food and things like that? And now imagine you're asking all of those questions and you are not a native English speaker. And that's the case for so many families across the United States. And in Indianapolis, Indianapolis Public Schools found that they weren't really reaching families in their native language. And some parents who were associated decided they needed to do something about it. So they were Spanish speakers, and over 90% of bilingual students in Indianapolis Public Schools speak Spanish. So these parents decided to develop Stand for Children Indiana, and they are an organization for bilingual advocacy with Indianapolis Public Schools, or IPS, that is working to develop communication and advocacy resources for families in conjunction with the school system, which is really fantastic. And they're really talking about how to get information to families and how to train schools on how to better communicate with their families. So a really simple example of something like that is the receptionist. When the receptionist at a school picks up the phone and the person on the other end of the line doesn't speak English, how would they respond? And just even teaching them to say un momento, to wait for just a moment so that they can find somebody who can communicate with that parent, is something I think in South Florida, I'll be honest, I think some of us are kind of spoiled in that that's not really a problem. Finding someone who can speak the language that you speak is a pretty easy thing.
We definitely take that for granted down here.
Take it for granted completely. That whoever you are speaking to, if they cannot communicate in your language, will find a way to communicate. And seeing that this is happening across the country and providing opportunities where bilingual population is growing significantly, and even if the students are not necessarily having the need for bilingual services, their parents and their families might definitely be in that case or in that situation. So this is a really exciting collaboration that's going on. And the fact that the district is listening to what these parents and advocates are saying is really important. So I'm going to link this article in the description box, obviously, with what Ryan was talking about. But I think it's really important that we take an opportunity to look at not just what our students' needs are, but what our families' needs are when we're talking about providing resources and services. And what's really exciting is that this, I think, was maybe prompted by, well, I'll be honest, in the article it says that they were starting these conversations before COVID-19 happened. However, that, as for many of us, was a huge eye-opening experience to where the gaps were in their services. So they are investing a significant amount of resources. Here they're saying, we have always been cognizant of the families we serve, adding that the pandemic crystallized the needs of families who are affected by school closures and staff shortages. It helped us realize we needed to make sure COVID didn't pause the work. And that's a really big issue, right? So a lot of our schools had been becoming aware of all of these issues with their families. But how do we make sure that this pandemic doesn't create wider gaps, which we hear has been happening when it comes to technology, when it comes to income, when it comes to all sorts of other things. And so making efforts to make sure that doesn't get paused or regress is tremendous. I'm really excited about that.
Absolutely. And it's a running theme on this program, the idea that the pandemic is going to identify gaps that exist in our system, whether it's a technology gap, whether it's resource gaps, and it will amplify them, and it will, if not properly addressed, expand them and, make them wider. And so I love what this article is talking about, especially, it hits a lot of marks for me in terms of, a nonprofit partner coming in to assist schools. The fact that it emphasizes training is so important. And the fact that, as you identified from that article, this is an important thing for the pandemic, but it's going to continue to be as the role of the school is continuing to evolve from just being a place where kids are educated to being a community center, to being a central source where services are distributed, where information is disseminated. And so making sure that we can identify that, some families that we're serving don't speak English, even if the students are learning English in that school, and having a solution to make sure that these parents can get their services, can get the information they need, and having a nonprofit partner to provide training and assistance on that, there's a lot to like about that.
Absolutely. And I think what's really important is listening to the fact that nonprofit partner is a parent-based organization, I think brings another layer to it that is really critical. Listening to where the pain points are for the families and meeting them where they are. So instead of saying, okay, well, you're having an issue, here's a website where you can find all of those things, and we're just going to Google Translate the website for you. No, what they did is they reached out to these parents that already have their connections and already they're a connector to that community, and they said, okay, can you develop a WhatsApp group, and we're gonna filter information through here, which I thought was really an excellent way of recognizing meeting people where they are, and how do we make sure that they're getting the information in a way that is native to them, right? Or is comfortable for them. So, because I can only imagine if you're talking about a situation where, like I said, with the pandemic, all of us were kind of at a loss and trying to scramble for information. But now let's imagine there's that additional barrier of not speaking the same language. We need to meet people where they are. How are they going to know to go to this website or that resource or wherever? Making those partnerships with our families and our parents and making sure that those barriers are removed as much as possible, that's the key to successful school-family connections.
And the other thing that you noted in that article that I think is an important point is you also have to identify where the touch points are. Where are these bilingual parents interacting, and where are the points of friction being created? You spoke about the fact that a parent is going to call the school, and the first voice they're going to hear is perhaps by default an English-speaking voice. Do you have a solution for when the person picks up, calls that phone and hears an English-speaking voice? How do you get around that to make sure that we can create the course of action to allow that Spanish-speaking parent to get the information they need? And, identifying those touch points, whether they exist on the phone call, to the reception desk, or to the website, is critical because, we don't want to lose those parents at that first step, right? We don't want them to get discouraged at that initial touch point.
You always want that message to be, you are welcome here and we're here to provide for you. Well, this has been a really great conversation, Ryan. Thanks so much for being with me today. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to join the conversation, please reach out to us using the hashtag Big Ideas in Education or at Academica Media. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you and goodbye.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.